In 1905, scientists thought they understood intelligence until a young boy named David Moore shattered everything they believed. His mind worked faster than their instruments could measure, and what he knew couldn't be taught. Doctors were baffled, professors were silent, and history quietly buried his name. This is the incredible case of the boy genius science couldn't explain. Dr. Heinrich Vollmer received the letter on a cold March morning in 1905, delivered to his office at the Institute for Psychological Research in Vienna by special courier. The envelope bore a London postmark and trembled slightly in his hands as he broke the wax seal. What he read in the next few minutes would compel him to abandon 3 ongoing research projects and board a train to England within 48 hours. The letter was from Dr. Margaret Ashworth, a physician working at St. Bartholomew's Hospital. Her words were measured, clinical, yet beneath the professional veneer. Vollmer detected something he had rarely encountered in his 30 years of studying the human mind: genuine bewilderment. "I'm writing to you," Dr. Ashworth had penned in careful script, "because I have exhausted all conventional explanations for a case that has consumed my attention for the past 6 months. The subject is a boy of 11 years, David Moore, the son of a coal merchant in Whitechapel. This child, Dr. Vollmer, is performing mathematical calculations that our most distinguished professors cannot comprehend, speaking in languages he has never been taught, and describing scientific principles that have only recently been discovered, and some that have not been discovered at all." Vollmer read the letter 3 times before setting it down. In his career, he had investigated dozens of so-called prodigies, savants, and wonder children. All had proven to be either elaborate hoaxes, cases of precocious but ultimately explicable talent, or children coached by ambitious parents seeking fame or fortune. But something in Dr. Ashworth's letter suggested this case was different. He was right. David Moore was born on a wet November evening in 1893 in a cramped flat above his father's coal yard in one of London's poorest districts. His mother, Elizabeth, had endured a difficult labor, and the midwife had privately told David's father, Thomas, that she doubted both mother and child would survive the night. But survive they did, and by morning, Elizabeth was nursing a healthy, dark-haired boy with unusually alert eyes. For the first 8 years of his life, David was unremarkable. He attended the local parish school irregularly, as did most children from working families who were often needed to help with household work, or in David's case, to sort coal and make deliveries. His teacher, Miss Eleanor Pritchard, would later testify that David had been a quiet, somewhat dreamy child who showed no particular aptitude for his studies. His reading was adequate, his arithmetic pedestrian, his handwriting poor. He would often stare out the window during lessons, Miss Pritchard recalled in her written statement to Dr. Vollmer. "I assumed he was simply daydreaming, as children do. He never caused trouble, never excelled, never stood out in any way whatsoever. If you had asked me in 1901 to predict which of my students would achieve greatness, David Moore would not have made the list." Everything changed in the winter of 1902, 3 months after David's 9th birthday. Thomas Moore was making a delivery to a gentleman's club in Mayfair when he suffered a stroke. The attack left him partially paralyzed on his left side, unable to continue his physically demanding work. The family's already precarious finances collapsed. Elizabeth took in washing and mending to earn what little she could, but it wasn't enough. They fell behind on rent. The coal business, their only real asset, began to fail. It was during this period of hardship that David's transformation began. The first incident occurred on a January evening in 1903. Elizabeth was attempting to calculate how to divide their remaining funds among their most pressing debts: the landlord, the grocer, the coal supplier. She sat at the kitchen table, her face drawn with worry, trying to work out the arithmetic by candlelight. David, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, suddenly spoke up. "You need to pay Mr. Hendricks the full amount," he said, referring to the landlord. "Give him £3, 7 shillings and 6 pence. Pay the grocer £1, 12 shillings. Pay the coal supplier 15 shillings. That leaves you with £1, 3 shillings and 2 pence for food and other necessities until father's next disability payment arrives in 13 days. Elizabeth looked at her son in surprise. "David, how could you possibly know? You have £6, 17 shillings and 8 pence total." David continued, his voice calm and certain. "I heard you counting it earlier. The landlord must be paid in full or he'll evict us. His notice said as much, and the law gives him the right after 6 weeks of arrears. The grocer will extend credit if you pay at least £1. He said so to Mrs. Henderson last week when we were in the shop. The coal supplier's payment can be delayed 1 more month without penalty, according to the terms father agreed to last summer." Elizabeth stared at her son. She had mentioned none of these details to him, at least not directly. Yet his calculations were perfect. She followed his advice, and it worked exactly as he had predicted. In the following weeks, similar incidents multiplied. David began correcting the prices called out by vendors in the market, instantly calculating the correct change from complex transactions. He pointed out an error in the parish church's bookkeeping that the vicar had been searching for weeks to find. He told a neighbor the exact day her baby would be born, based on information he had overheard about when she had conceived, and he was right. At first, Elizabeth and Thomas attributed their son's new abilities to simple cleverness. Perhaps he had always been bright, and they simply hadn't noticed. But as the weeks turned to months, David's abilities grew more inexplicable. He began speaking German. Neither of David's parents spoke a word of German. They had never left England. There were no German speakers in their neighborhood, no German books in their home. Yet David began using German phrases, then sentences, then holding complex conversations in flawless Hochdeutsch with a German merchant who occasionally visited the neighborhood. When the astonished merchant asked David where he had learned such perfect German, the boy had simply said, "I'm not sure, I just know it." The German was followed by French, then Italian, then Latin and ancient Greek. A visiting scholar from Cambridge, who happened to hear David speaking Latin to himself in the street, engaged the boy in conversation and later wrote that David's command of classical Latin was superior to that of most of my undergraduate students, and his pronunciation, remarkably, matches the theoretical reconstructions of how educated Romans of the 1st century would have spoken. But it was David's mathematical and scientific pronouncements that truly defied explanation. In April of 1903, David's father took him along on a visit to a doctor at St. Bartholomew's Hospital, where Thomas was seeking treatment for his stroke-damaged arm. While waiting in the corridor, David struck up a conversation with a young medical student who was sketching diagrams in a notebook. "You've made an error in your rendering of the cardiovascular system," David said politely, looking over the student's shoulder. The student, whose name was William Chen, laughed. I don't think so, young man. I've been studying anatomy for 2 years. The branching pattern of the coronary arteries isn't quite right, David persisted. He pointed to the diagram. You've shown the left anterior descending artery branching at a 90-degree angle, but it actually emerges at approximately 45 degrees and follows a more sinuous path. And you're missing the septal perforating branches entirely. Chen's smile faded. He pulled out his anatomy textbook and checked the illustration. David was absolutely correct. How did you know that? Chen asked, now genuinely curious. I can see it, David said simply. When I close my eyes, I can see how the blood moves through the heart, how the vessels branch and reconnect. I can see the electrical impulses that make it beat. Chen brought David to meet his professor, Dr. Margaret Ashworth, who had pioneered new surgical techniques for cardiac conditions. Dr. Ashworth was a practical woman, not given to flights of fancy, but she was also genuinely curious about unusual phenomena. She spent an hour questioning David about human anatomy and physiology. The boy's knowledge was extraordinary. He described structures that had only recently been identified by microscopy. He explained physiological processes in language that was sometimes crude but always accurate. When Dr. Ashworth showed him slides under a microscope, David pointed out cellular features before she could identify them herself. "This is remarkable," Dr. Ashworth said to Thomas More. "Your son has either read medical texts far beyond his years, or he possesses some form of intuitive understanding of biological systems that I cannot explain." "He's barely read anything at all, Doctor," Thomas replied. "We can't afford books, and he's never been one for reading anyway." Dr. Ashworth decided to test David more rigorously. Over the next several months, she presented him with increasingly complex medical and scientific problems. She showed him chemical formulas and asked him to predict the results of reactions. She described symptoms and asked for diagnoses. She presented him with mathematical problems from cutting-edge physics research. David's success rate was astounding. He could not always explain how he knew the answers, but he was correct far more often than chance would allow. More disturbing still, he sometimes provided answers to questions that had not yet been definitively answered by science itself. In one particularly striking example, Dr. Ashworth described a problem her colleague at Cambridge was working on regarding the behavior of electrons in cathode ray tubes. David listened carefully, then said, "The electrons are moving in discrete packets, not continuously. The energy is quantized. That's why the measurements don't match the predictions from wave theory." This was months before Albert Einstein would publish his paper on the photoelectric effect, which would help establish quantum theory. A 9-year-old boy from Whitechapel had intuited one of the fundamental insights of 20th century physics. Dr. Ashworth began to document everything. She was a scientist, and she knew that extraordinary claims required extraordinary evidence. She had David examined by other physicians to rule out any obvious trickery. She tested his knowledge in areas where coaching would be impossible. She investigated his family background to see if there was any hidden source for his knowledge. She found nothing that could explain David More. When Dr. Heinrich Vollmer arrived in London in March 1905, David was 11 years old and had become something of a quiet sensation in certain scientific circles. Dr. Ashworth had been discreet, sharing her findings only with trusted colleagues, but word had spread nonetheless. The Psychological Society had heard rumors. The Royal Academy of Sciences had received inquiries. A few journalists had begun sniffing around, though Dr. Ashworth had managed to keep them at bay. Vollmer was in his late 50s, a stern-looking man with wire-rimmed spectacles and a reputation for ruthless skepticism. Had built his career on debunking spiritualists, exposing fraudulent mediums, and providing rational explanations for seemingly supernatural phenomena. He expected to do the same with David Moore. His first meeting with the boy took place in Dr. Ashworth's office at St. Bartholomew's Hospital on a rainy afternoon. David arrived with his mother, a worn-looking woman who clearly felt out of place in the august surroundings. David himself was a slight child, shorter than average for his age, with dark hair, pale skin, and those remarkably alert eyes that Vollmer had read about in Dr. Ashworth's reports. "Hello, David," Vollmer said in German, without preamble. "Wie geht es dir heute?" "Mir geht es gut, danke," David replied without hesitation. "Aber ich glaube, Sie würden lieber Englisch sprechen, da meine Mutter kein Deutsch versteht." Vollmer's eyes widened slightly. David had not only responded in perfect German, but had politely suggested they switch to English so his mother wouldn't feel excluded. The boy's accent was impeccable, his grammar flawless. Over the next 3 weeks, Vollmer subjected David to the most rigorous testing he had ever devised. He tested him in Latin, Greek, German, French, and Italian. He presented mathematical problems of increasing difficulty. He asked David to describe scientific principles from physics, chemistry, biology, and astronomy. He tried to trick him with false information to see if the boy was simply agreeing with whatever he was told. He separated David from his parents to eliminate any possibility of hidden signaling. The results were unambiguous. David Moore possessed knowledge that he could not possibly have acquired through normal means. But it was during one particular session that Vollmer experienced something that shook him to his core. He had been questioning David about atomic theory, a cutting-edge field that most trained scientists barely understood. David was describing the structure of atoms with casual accuracy when he suddenly paused. "You're thinking about your daughter," David said quietly. Vollmer froze. "I beg your pardon?" "Your daughter, Anna. You're thinking about her. You're worried about her." Vollmer felt the blood drain from his face. His daughter Anna had died of tuberculosis 5 years earlier. He had not mentioned her to anyone in England. There was no possible way David could know about her. "How did you—" "I don't know," David said, and for the first time, the boy looked troubled. "Sometimes I just know things about people. I can see thoughts, feelings, memories. Not always, and I can't control it, but sometimes it just happens. You were thinking about her just now. You were remembering the last time you read to her, a story about a princess and a dragon. You wish you had told her you loved her one more time before she died." Vollmer stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. His hands were shaking. Everything David had said was true. The story about the princess, his regret about not saying "I love you" one last time. These were his most private thoughts, memories he had shared with no one. "I apologize, Dr. Vollmer," David said softly. "I didn't mean to upset you. I can't always control what I perceive." Vollmer sat back down slowly. For the first time in his career, he was confronting something that his scientific framework could not accommodate. This was not trickery. It was not fraud. David Moore was somehow accessing information that should be impossible for him to access. By the summer of 1905, keeping David's abilities secret was no longer possible. A journalist had gotten wind of the story, And although Dr. Ashworth and Vollmer did their best to control the narrative, sensationalized accounts began appearing in newspapers across Britain and Europe. The Miracle Boy of Whitechapel screamed one headline. Child genius baffles scientists, declared another. The story had everything the public craved. A poor child with extraordinary powers, baffled experts, hints of the supernatural, and a mystery that science couldn't explain. The attention was unwelcome. Thomas and Elizabeth Moore were simple people who wanted only to protect their son. The constant requests for interviews, demonstrations, and examinations were overwhelming. Spiritualists claimed David was proof of their beliefs about the soul and the afterlife. Religious groups argued he was evidence of divine intervention. Skeptics insisted the whole thing was an elaborate hoax. The scientific establishment was divided. Some researchers, like Vollmer and Ashworth, insisted that while they couldn't explain David's abilities, the evidence was solid and demanded serious investigation. Others dismissed the case entirely, arguing that any sufficiently clever fraud could fool even experienced investigators. A few suggested that David might represent an evolutionary leap, a new stage in human cognitive development. The controversy took its toll on David himself. He became withdrawn, speaking less freely about what he knew or perceived. The constant testing and questioning exhausted him. He began having nightmares, waking in the middle of the night, screaming about things he couldn't explain. It's too much, he told Dr. Ashworth during one session. All the knowing, all the seeing. Sometimes I wish I could just be normal again. I wish I could forget. And then, as mysteriously as it had begun, David's abilities started to fade. The first sign came in September 1905. David was working on a mathematical problem with Vollmer when he suddenly stopped mid-calculation. I don't know the next step, he said, confusion evident in his voice. I could see it a moment ago, but now it's gone. Over the following weeks, David's extraordinary abilities deteriorated. His fluency in foreign languages became halting, then fragmentary, then vanished entirely. His intuitive grasp of scientific principles faded. His apparent ability to perceive others' thoughts disappeared completely. By November, David Moore was once again an ordinary 11-year-old boy. Medical examinations revealed nothing. There was no physical trauma, no disease, no obvious explanation for the change. It was as if whatever window had opened in David's mind had quietly closed. Dr. Vollmer was devastated. He had spent months documenting David's abilities, and now his subject was returning to normalcy before his eyes. Dr. Ashworth was equally dismayed, though she tried to hide her disappointment. They both increased the frequency of their tests, hoping to capture some lingering trace of David's former capabilities. But it was no use. David himself seemed relieved. I feel more like myself, he told his mother. It was like I had someone else's mind inside my head, and now they've gone away. The newspapers lost interest. The scientific community moved on to other mysteries. The spiritualists and religious groups found new wonders to champion. Within a year, the incredible case of David Moore was largely forgotten by the wider world. David Moore lived until 1968, dying at the age of 74 in a modest house in Surrey. He had married, raised 3 children, and worked for most of his life as an accountant, a profession that required mathematical ability, but nothing extraordinary. By all accounts, he lived a quiet, content, unremarkable life. He almost never spoke about the years of his childhood, when he had been, briefly, perhaps the most intellectually capable person on earth. When pressed by his children or grandchildren, he would simply say, "I was different for a while when I was young. Then I became normal again. That's all there is to tell." But Dr. Heinrich Vollmer never forgot. He spent the remaining 20 years of his life trying to understand what had happened to David Moore. He investigated dozens of other supposed prodigies and savants, always searching for another case that might shed light on David's transformation. He found none that compared. In his private journals published posthumously in 1929, Vollmer wrote extensively about the David Moore case. He concluded that he had witnessed something that challenged the fundamental assumptions of psychology, neuroscience, and perhaps even physics itself. "I entered this investigation as a skeptic," he wrote, "fully expecting to expose either fraud or self-deception. Instead, I encountered a phenomenon that I cannot explain within any existing scientific framework. David Moore, for approximately 3 years of his childhood, possessed cognitive abilities that exceeded not only those of normal humans, but those that our understanding of neurology suggests should be possible. He acquired knowledge through means that violated every principle of information theory and epistemology. He perceived aspects of reality that should have been inaccessible to him. And then, as inexplicably as these abilities appeared, they vanished, leaving behind only an ordinary boy who would grow into an ordinary man. Was David's transformation a glimpse of latent human potential that occasionally manifests under unknown conditions? Was it evidence of something beyond the material world? Was it a window into a deeper reality that we do not yet understand? I cannot say. I can only report what I witnessed and admit that it lies beyond the boundaries of my comprehension. Dr. Margaret Ashworth also continued to ponder the mystery. In a lecture delivered to the Royal Society of Medicine in 1922, she discussed the David Moore case as an example of how science must remain humble in the face of phenomena it cannot explain. The history of science, she told her audience, is filled with phenomena that were once inexplicable, but later understood through new discoveries and new frameworks. It is also filled with phenomena that we now recognize as misunderstood or misreported. But I believe David Moore represents a third category, a genuine mystery that may be pointing us toward aspects of reality that our current scientific paradigm cannot accommodate. We tested this child rigorously. We documented his abilities with care. We eliminated every possibility of fraud or error that we could imagine. And yet, what we documented should not have been possible. Rather than dismissing our findings because they conflict with our theories, perhaps we should be asking what our theories are missing. In the decades since David Moore's death, scientists, historians, and philosophers have continued to debate his case. The evidence collected by Vollmer and Ashworth remains in archives, available for examination. Their documentation is thorough and professional. Their credentials are impeccable, and yet their findings remain inexplicable. Some have suggested that David experienced a rare neurological condition that temporarily enhanced his cognitive abilities to an extraordinary degree. But no such condition has ever been documented before or since, and the mechanism by which it could impart knowledge of things David had never studied remains unclear. Others have proposed that David was an exceptionally gifted child who, through some combination of eidetic memory and exposure to information he later forgot he had encountered, created the illusion of impossible knowledge. But this explanation struggles to account for his accurate predictions of scientific principles not yet discovered, or his apparent ability to perceive the thoughts of others. Still, others have suggested that the entire case was an elaborate fraud perpetrated by David and his family, or that Vollmer and Ashworth were somehow deceived despite their expertise. But the motive for such an extended deception remains unclear. The Moore family never profited significantly from David's fame, and Vollmer's reputation for skepticism makes him an unlikely dupe. The most unsettling explanation is the simplest, that for reasons we do not understand, a working-class boy from Whitechapel briefly gained access to knowledge and abilities that transcended the normal limits of human cognition, and then lost that access just as mysteriously as he had gained it. David's own explanation, given late in life to his eldest daughter, was characteristically simple. "I think my mind opened up for a while, and I could see things that are usually hidden. Then it closed again, and I went back to being just David." Maybe everyone's mind could open that way under the right conditions. Maybe I was just lucky, or unlucky, depending on how you look at it. That mine did. The case of David Moore remains one of the most thoroughly documented and yet utterly baffling incidents in the history of psychology and paranormal research. It sits in an uncomfortable space between verified fact and impossible claim, supported by credible witnesses and rigorous testing, yet defying every attempt at rational explanation. In the years since David's death, his story has inspired countless works of fiction, numerous academic papers, and endless speculation. Some see it as evidence of latent psychic abilities. Others view it as proof that human consciousness is far stranger than mainstream neuroscience acknowledges. Still others dismiss it as a historical curiosity, a case where even honest investigators can be systematically fooled. But perhaps the most important legacy of David Moore is not any specific explanation of his abilities, but rather the questions his case continues to raise about the limits of human potential and the boundaries of the possible. What if consciousness is not confined to the brain, but can somehow access information through means we don't understand? What if the rigid barriers we perceive between minds are not as absolute as we assume? What if human cognitive abilities are not fixed but fluid, capable of extraordinary expansion under circumstances we have not yet identified? These are not comfortable questions for a materialist worldview. They suggest that reality might be far stranger than we are prepared to accept. They imply that the map of human capability we have drawn is incomplete, that there are territories of cognition we have not yet explored. David Moore lived most of his life as an ordinary man. He paid his taxes, raised his family, tended his garden, and died peacefully in his sleep. But for a brief window of time, he was something else, something more, something different, something that science could observe but not explain. In his personal effects, discovered after his death, was a notebook he had kept during the years of his transformation. Most of it was filled with mathematical equations, anatomical sketches, and notes in various languages. But on the final page, written in a shaky hand many years later, was a single sentence in English. "I remember everything. I understand nothing. I miss it every day." That sentence, perhaps more than any scientific analysis, captures the profound mystery of David Moore. He experienced something extraordinary, something that changed him forever, even after it faded away, something that hinted at capabilities and realities beyond our current understanding. And we are left to wonder, was David Moore a unique anomaly, a one-time glitch in the fabric of reality? Or was he evidence of something fundamental about consciousness and human potential that we have yet to comprehend? Was his gift, if gift it was, a rare accident or a preview of what humans might someday become? More than a century after David Moore's transformation, we still have no answers. We have only the documented facts, the testimony of credible witnesses, and the haunting possibility that everything we think we know about the mind and its possibilities might be incomplete. The case remains open. The mystery endures. And perhaps that is exactly as it should be. For as Dr. Vollmer wrote in his final journal entry before his death, the purpose of science is not to explain away wonder, but to deepen it by revealing the true complexity of the world. David Moore showed us that the world is far more complex than we had imagined. Whether we ever understand what happened to him or not, we should be grateful for the reminder that reality is larger than our theories and that the universe still has secrets to reveal. The incredible case of David Moore stands as a reminder that for all our knowledge and all our scientific progress, we have not yet mapped the full territory of human possibility. Somewhere in that unmapped territory, a young boy from Whitechapel once walked, and perhaps someday others will follow the path he briefly traveled. Until then, we are left with questions, mysteries, and the extraordinary testimony of those who witnessed something that should not have been possible, but for a brief and shining moment, undeniably was.